On November 14th, 1993, a library volunteer named Margaret Holloway walked into the basement archives of the Crescent Hill Public Library in Louisville, Kentucky. She never walked out. Police searched every corner of the building. They found her glasses on a cart. They found her coat draped over a chair. But Margaret, 47 years old, mother of two, known by everyone as dependable and cautious, had simply vanished. The library sat on a single floor with one entrance, one exit, and no windows in the archive room. Security footage from the lobby showed her entering at 9:12 a.m. It never showed her leaving. For 3 decades, her disappearance remained Louisville's quietest cold case. No body, no leads, no closure. Her family held memorials. Her name faded from local news. The library renovated twice, and still, nothing. Then, in September of this year, something impossible happened. A library patron checking out books noticed a familiar name scrawled inside a donated hardcover. The handwriting matched samples from Margaret's personal journals. The book had been logged into the system only 2 weeks earlier. It hadn't been there before. And inside the cover, beneath her signature, was a date, November 14th, 1993, the day she disappeared. The book was a first edition of The King in Yellow, a collection of strange, unsettling short stories about a play that drives its readers to madness. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the title. It was the inscription on the following page, written in Margaret's unmistakable hand, "I should have listened. Don't go looking for what's been buried." This is the story of a woman who walked into silence, and the book that crawled back into the light 30 years later. If you want to hear how deep this goes, stay with me. And if this kind of story keeps you up at night, go ahead and hit that like button. Let's begin. Margaret Holloway wasn't the kind of person who disappeared. She was steady, predictable, the kind of woman who arrived early, left late, and always remembered your birthday. She'd been volunteering at Crescent Hill Public Library for 6 years, organizing archives, cataloging donations, and helping patrons find obscure historical records. She loved the work. It gave her purpose after her children grew up and moved away. Her husband, Paul, said she treated the library like a second home. The morning of November 14th, 1993, began like any other. Margaret kissed Paul goodbye at 8:30 a.m., and drove the 12 minutes to the library. She parked in her usual spot. She waved to the head librarian, Diane Cresswell, as she passed the circulation desk. Diane later told police that Margaret seemed cheerful, maybe even excited. She mentioned something about finally getting to a box of donations that had been sitting untouched for months. The library's basement archive was a cramped, dim space filled with metal shelves and cardboard boxes. It wasn't open to the public. Only staff and volunteers with a key could access it. Margaret had that key. She descended the staircase at 9:12 a.m., captured clearly on the lobby's security camera. She carried a clipboard and a thermos of tea. The camera faced the only entrance. There were no blind spots, no back doors, no windows large enough for a person to fit through. At 11 a.m., Diane went downstairs to check on Margaret. The archive was silent. The lights were on. A cart of books sat in the middle of the aisle, half sorted. Margaret's glasses rested on top of a stack of paperbacks. Her coat hung over the back of a folding chair. Her thermos sat on a shelf, still warm. But Margaret was gone. Diane called her name. She searched every row, every corner. Nothing. She ran upstairs and reviewed the security footage. Margaret had entered. She had not left. Paul Holloway arrived at the library within 20 minutes of Diane's call. He was pale, shaking. Police were already there, combing the building. They checked storage closets, restrooms, the boiler room. They brought in dogs. They interviewed every staff member and patron who'd been in the building that morning. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. The archive door had been locked from the inside. Diane had needed Margaret's key to open it. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no forced entry. Over the following weeks, the investigation widened. Detectives examined Margaret's personal life. They found nothing suspicious. No affairs, no debts, no history of mental illness or suicidal ideation. Her bank accounts hadn't been touched. Her car remained in the parking lot. Paul cooperated fully, submitting to multiple interviews and a polygraph. He passed. Friends and family described Margaret as content, stable, and deeply invested in her routines. The idea that she'd willingly walked away made no sense. Theories emerged, as they always do. Some believed she'd been abducted, though how and by whom, no one could explain. Others suggested she'd suffered a medical emergency and somehow left the building unnoticed, despite the cameras. A few whispered darker possibilities: secret tunnels, hidden rooms, foul play covered up by someone with access. But nothing held up under scrutiny. The library was a simple, single-story building constructed in 1968. There were no tunnels, no hidden passages. The basement had been inspected, measured, and searched with ground-penetrating radar. It was exactly what it appeared to be: a rectangular room with concrete walls and one staircase. By early 1994, the case had gone cold. Margaret's face appeared on missing person posters for a few years, then slowly faded. Paul kept her room unchanged. Her daughter visited every Thanksgiving and sat in the archive for an hour, hoping for something, anything that might explain what happened. But the silence remained, until 30 years later, when a book came back. In September 2023, a college student named Aaron Pruitt was browsing the fiction section at Crescent Hill Public Library. He was looking for something atmospheric to read before Halloween, something strange and old. He found a worn hardcover wedged between two modern thrillers, The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. First edition, published in 1895. The cover was faded yellow cloth, the spine slightly cracked. Aaron liked the look of it. He checked it out. That night, he opened the book and noticed the handwriting inside the front cover. It was careful, looping script in blue ink. Margaret Holloway, November 14th, 1993. Below that, on the next page, another line. I should have listened. Don't go looking for what's been buried. Aaron didn't recognize the name, but something about the date felt familiar. He Googled it. Within minutes, he was staring at decades-old news articles about a library volunteer who'd vanished without explanation. He looked at the book again. His hands went cold. He brought it back to the library the next morning and asked to speak to someone in charge. Diane Cresswell, now in her 70s and still working part-time, nearly dropped the book when she saw the signature. She knew Margaret's handwriting. She'd seen it on 1,000 catalog cards, sticky notes, and margin annotations. This was hers. No question. But how? The book hadn't been in the library system 30 years ago, Diane would have remembered. And more troubling, it had been logged into circulation only 2 weeks earlier, part of a batch donation from an estate sale across town. Diane called Paul Holloway. He arrived within the hour, his hands trembling as he held the book. He confirmed it. The handwriting was Margaret's. But he'd never seen this book before. Margaret had liked mysteries and historical fiction, but he didn't recall her mentioning The King in Yellow. And the inscription, "Don't go looking for what's been buried," was unlike anything she'd ever written. It sounded like a warning. Paul contacted the police. Detective Raymond Carver, who'd worked the original case as a junior officer, came out of retirement to review the evidence. He examined the book carefully. The ink had aged naturally. It wasn't a fresh forgery. The paper was consistent with early 1990s stock. The handwriting matched exemplars taken from Margaret's journals and letters. Forensic analysis confirmed it. Margaret Holloway had written in this book on or around the day she disappeared. But where had it been for 30 years? And how did it end up in a donation pile from an estate sale in October 2023? Carver tracked down the source. The book had come from the estate of a man named Victor Leland, who died in late September at age 81. Leland had been a retired history professor and a reclusive collector of rare books. He lived alone in a decaying Victorian house on the east side of Louisville, less than 3 miles from Crescent Hill Library. His estate had been liquidated by a nephew who barely knew him. Boxes of books, furniture, and personal effects were sold off or donated. No one had paid much attention to individual titles. Carver interviewed the nephew. He knew almost nothing about his uncle's life. Victor had been estranged from the family for decades, ever since a falling out in the 1980s over something no one would discuss. He'd never married. He'd taught medieval history at the University of Louisville until his retirement in 1991. After that, he'd become increasingly withdrawn. Neighbors described him as polite, but strange. Always reading, always alone, always keeping his curtains drawn. Carver asked if Victor had ever mentioned Margaret Holloway. The nephew shook his head. The name meant nothing to him, but when Carver showed him a photo of Margaret from 1993, the nephew paused. He said Victor had kept a photo album in his study, mostly old university pictures. He'd seen a woman who looked similar in one of the group shots, but he couldn't be sure. Carver obtained a warrant to search what remained of Victor Leland's estate. Most of it had been cleared out, but the house itself still stood, waiting to be sold. Carver and a small team entered the property on a gray October afternoon. The air inside smelled of mildew and old paper. The walls were lined with bookshelves, floor to ceiling, packed with volumes on folklore, occult history, and medieval manuscripts. In the study, they found the photo album. And there she was, Margaret Holloway, younger, smiling, standing in a group of people outside the university library. The photo was dated 1986. Victor Leland stood beside her. Victor Leland and Margaret Holloway had known each other. That single photograph changed everything. Carver dug deeper into Victor's background, searching for any connection that might explain how Margaret's book ended up in his possession, and why it had taken 30 years to surface. University records showed that Margaret had taken evening classes at the University of Louisville between 1985 and 1987. She'd been pursuing a certificate in archival studies, hoping to formalize her volunteer work at the library. Victor Leland had been one of her instructors. He taught a course called Medieval Texts and Folklore Preservation. Margaret had earned an A. Classmates. Carver interviewed, remembered her as quiet, diligent, and fascinated by the material. They also remembered Victor as intense, brilliant, but unsettling. He spoke about old books as if they were alive. He warned students not to read certain texts aloud, claiming some stories carried curses. One former student recalled a lecture where Victor discussed The King, in yellow, the same book Margaret had signed. He described it as dangerous, not because of its content, but because of what it represented. The idea that some stories could rewrite the mind of the reader. He'd called it a literary contagion. He'd said that the original manuscripts of certain cursed plays and poems had been buried or burned for a reason, and that some collectors spent their lives trying to find them. Margaret had been in that class. According to the student, she'd asked questions. She'd been intrigued. Carver returned to Victor's house and examined his collection more carefully. Most of the books were academic, histories, translations, annotated folklore. But in a locked cabinet in the study, he found something else. A handwritten journal. The entries spanned from 1989 to 1993. Victor's handwriting was small, precise, obsessive. He wrote about his research into buried texts, manuscripts that had been deliberately hidden by religious authorities, royal courts, or their own authors. He believed some of these texts had been concealed beneath old buildings, in false walls, or in forgotten archive rooms. In an entry from October 1993, Victor wrote about Crescent Hill Library. He noted that the building had been constructed on the site of an older structure, a private estate that burned down in 1887. The estate's owner, a man named Elias Greer, had been a playwright and occultist. According to Victor's notes, Greer had written a play that was never performed, a work he claimed was inspired by the Yellow King. Greer had died in the fire, and most of his writings were believed lost. But Victor suspected that some of Greer's manuscripts had survived, hidden in the ruins before the library was built over them. And then on November 10th, 1993, 4 days before Margaret disappeared, Victor wrote, "M has agreed to help. She has access to the archive room. If the manuscripts are there, she'll find them." Carver felt his chest tighten. Margaret hadn't vanished by accident. She'd been looking for something. He continued reading. The entries after November 10th became erratic. On November 15th, the day after Margaret's disappearance, Victor wrote, "She didn't come back. I waited. I called. She didn't come back. I should never have told her where to look." The next entry, dated November the 20th. "I went to the library. They've sealed the archive. Police everywhere. I can't ask questions. If they connect me to her, they'll search my home. I can't let them find the book." The final entry, dated December the 3rd, 1993. "I found it in my mailbox this morning. No note. Just the book. She must have mailed it before whatever happened. I don't know if she ever opened it. I don't know if she read the inscription inside. I can't keep it here. I can't destroy it. I'll bury it with the rest. Someday, someone will understand." Carver sat back, his mind racing. Margaret had found something in the archive, something connected to Elias Greer's buried manuscripts. She'd taken it. She'd hidden it, or mailed it, or tried to return it. And then, she'd vanished. But what had she found? And where had she gone? Carver returned to Crescent Hill Library and requested access to the archive room. It looked nothing like it had in 1993. It had been renovated twice, the shelves replaced, the floor retiled. But the bones of the room were the same. Carver brought in a structural engineer and ground-penetrating radar equipment. They scanned the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and they found it. A hollow space. Behind the north wall, approximately 4 feet below the current floor level, there was a cavity, roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. It had been sealed with brick and plaster, likely during the original construction in 1968. The engineer said it was consistent with old foundation work, possibly covering debris from the 1887 fire. Carver obtained permission to excavate. On a cold morning in late October, workers carefully removed a section of the wall. The air that escaped smelled of ash and rot. Inside the cavity, they found charred wooden beams, fragments of burned paper, and a small iron lockbox, rusted but intact. Carver opened the box. Inside were 3 items: a bundle of handwritten pages, brittle and smoke-damaged, a playbill from 1886 advertising a private performance of something called The Pallid Mask, and a leather-bound journal belonging to Elias Greer. The handwritten pages were a manuscript, a play written in Greer's hand. The title page read, "The King in Yellow, a play in 2 acts." It wasn't a copy. It was an original. Carver didn't read the play. He'd seen enough in Victor's journal to know better. Instead, he sealed the manuscript in an evidence bag and contacted a forensic archivist at the University of Louisville. Dr. Ellison Hayes, a specialist in 19th century manuscripts, agreed to examine it under controlled conditions. But even Hayes, careful and skeptical by nature, hesitated when he saw the title. The King in Yellow was a real book, published in 1895 by Robert W. Chambers. It was a collection of short stories, some of which referenced a fictional play by the same name, a play that, within the stories, drove its readers and audiences insane. Chambers had never written the play itself. It existed only as a sinister reference, a story within a story. But for over a century, collectors and occultists had whispered about lost versions, manuscripts that predated Chambers, written by unknown authors who'd claimed to channel the play from something older and darker. Elias Greer had apparently been one of them. According to his journal, he'd begun writing the play in 1884 after discovering references to the Yellow King in medieval French manuscripts. He believed the figure was real, not a king in any political sense, but a concept, a presence that existed in the margins of human thought. He claimed the play was a ritual, not a performance. He wrote that reading it aloud would open a door that shouldn't be opened. Greer had planned a private performance in October 1887. He'd invited a small audience, scholars, artists, members of Louisville's occult circles. But the performance never happened. The night before, his estate burned to the ground. Greer died in the fire. Witnesses reported that the flames were unnaturally bright and that Greer's screams sounded like laughter. The ruins were cleared, and decades later, Crescent Hill Library was built on the site. The hollow space behind the archive wall had likely been part of Greer's original foundation, a hidden compartment where he'd stored his manuscripts. And somehow, in 1993, Margaret Holloway had found them. But how? And why had she disappeared? Dr. Hayes examined the manuscript carefully. He noted that the pages were heavily annotated in Greer's hand, with warnings scrawled in the margins. Do not speak this aloud. The second act is the door. He is listening. Hayes also found something else, a loose page tucked between the final act and the back cover. It was newer, written on 1990s era notebook paper in blue ink, Margaret's handwriting. The note read, "Victor was right. It's real. I heard it while I was reading." A voice under the words. I thought it was my imagination, but it's not. I shouldn't have opened this. I shouldn't have read past the first act. I don't know what to do. I'm going to put it back. I'm going to seal it again. If anyone finds this, don't read the play. Don't say the words. It listens. Carver felt a chill settle over him. Margaret had found the manuscript in the archive. She'd read it, or at least part of it. And then something had happened. She'd tried to return it, to hide it again, but she hadn't made it out. Carver reviewed the timeline. Margaret had entered the archive at 9:12 a.m. on November 14th, 1993. Diane Cresswell had found the room empty at 11 a.m. That gave Margaret less than 2 hours. In that time, she discovered the hidden compartment, opened it, read part of the manuscript, written a warning, and then what? Vanished? Carver considered every rational explanation. A hidden exit, a medical episode, foul play, but none of it fit. The archive had been searched exhaustively. There were no exits, no evidence of violence, and if Margaret had suffered a medical emergency, where was her body? Unless she'd never left the room. Unless she was still there. Carver returned to the archive with cadaver dogs. They searched every inch of the renovated space. The dogs alerted in 2 places, near the north wall, where the hidden compartment had been found, and in the center of the room, directly beneath where Margaret's cart had been discovered in 1993. Carver ordered a second excavation. Workers removed tiles and concrete. 3 feet down, they found something. Not a body. A space. Another hollow cavity, smaller than the first. Barely large enough for a person to fit inside. It had been sealed with brick, just like the compartment in the wall. But this one was newer. The mortar was consistent with early 1990s materials. Someone had built it after the library's construction. Carver's hands shook as he knelt beside the opening. Inside the cavity, they found Margaret's thermos, her key, and her purse. But no body. Just those objects, arranged carefully, as if someone had placed them there, intentionally. And beneath them, written in chalk on the brick floor of the cavity, were 2 words. He listens. Carver stood, his mind reeling. Someone had sealed Margaret's belongings inside the floor. But who? And why? And where was Margaret? He thought of Victor Leland, the journal entries, the fear in his words. I should never have told her where to look. Had Victor done this? Had he returned to the library after Margaret disappeared, retrieved the manuscript, and sealed her belongings in the floor to hide the evidence? But that didn't explain where Margaret had gone, or how her book had ended up in Victor's house, unless Margaret had never left the archive because she couldn't, because something Carver didn't want to name, had taken her. Carver didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in hauntings or rituals or doors that opened into nowhere. But he couldn't ignore the facts. Margaret had found a manuscript. She'd read it. She'd disappeared. And 30 years later, a book with her handwriting had surfaced in the home of a man who'd known her, a man who died 1 month before the book reappeared. Carver decided to confront the one thing he'd been avoiding, the manuscript itself. He needed to understand what Margaret had read, what she'd heard. He asked Dr. Hayes to summarize the content without reading it aloud. Hayes was reluctant. He said the manuscript was disturbing, not because of graphic content, but because of structure. The play was written in 2 acts. The first act seemed like a normal, if unsettling, drama about a royal court and a masked figure who arrives to claim a throne. But the second act dissolved into something else. The dialogue stopped making linear sense. The stage directions described impossible actions. Characters walking through walls, speaking in reverse, vanishing mid-sentence. And woven throughout were passages in a language Hayes couldn't identify. Something old, guttural, written phonetically. Hayes said the annotations suggested Greer believed the second act was meant to be spoken aloud, and that doing so would call the king's attention. Greer had written that the king was always listening, waiting for someone to speak his name correctly, and once you did, he would answer. Carver asked what happened if the king answered. Hayes closed the folder. He said Greer's journal didn't specify. It only said, "You go where he is, and you don't come back." Carver felt his stomach turn. He thought of Margaret, alone in the archive, reading by dim light. Had she read the second act aloud? Had she spoken the words, not realizing what they were? And if she had, where had she gone? He returned to Victor's journal, searching for answers. In the final weeks before Margaret's disappearance, Victor had written obsessively about thresholds and thinner places. He believed certain locations, places built on old tragedies, places where the boundary between the living world and something else had worn thin, could become doorways if the right ritual was performed. He thought the archive room was one of those places, and he thought Greer's play was the key. Victor had told Margaret where to look. He'd encouraged her to find the manuscript. But he hadn't told her what it was. Or maybe he had, and she hadn't believed him. Either way, she'd opened it, she'd read it, and she'd vanished. Carver made one final visit to Crescent Hill Library. He stood in the archive, now half dismantled, and tried to imagine what Margaret had experienced. The silence, the dim light, the weight of old paper in her hands, the words on the page, strange and rhythmic, pulling her forward. And then, what? A sound? A presence? A door that shouldn't exist, opening in the corner of her vision? He didn't know. He couldn't know. But he thought of the inscription she'd left in the book. I should have listened. Don't go looking for what's been buried. She'd known. In those final moments, she'd known she'd made a mistake, and she'd tried to warn whoever came after. Carver closed the case file. There was no body to recover, no crime to prosecute. Victor Leland was dead. The manuscript was sealed in a university vault, never to be read aloud again, and Margaret Holloway remained missing. Her fate unresolved. But Carver couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't gone, not in the way people usually were. He thought of the book, reappearing 30 years later. He thought of the inscription, the warning, the careful handwriting. And he wondered if Margaret had found a way to send a message, even from wherever she'd gone. A message that said, "I'm still here." And so was he. Paul Holloway held the book in his hands one last time before donating it back to the library. He'd asked to keep it, but Carver convinced him it belonged in the archive, sealed, preserved, and never circulated again. Paul agreed. He said Margaret would have wanted people to be safe. The book was placed in a locked display case in the library's local history room, alongside a plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Holloway, 1946-1993, beloved volunteer and seeker of knowledge." Visitors often stopped to read the inscription. Some asked about her story. The librarians told them the basics: a woman who loved books, who disappeared while working, whose case remains unsolved. They didn't mention the manuscript. They didn't mention the hollow spaces, the chalk words, or the warnings. Those details stayed buried in Carver's report, filed away in a basement storage room where cold cases go to sleep. But sometimes, late at night, when the library is closed and the lights are off, staff members report hearing something in the archive. A faint sound, like pages turning, or a voice, soft and careful, reading aloud in a language no one recognizes. The recordings from the security cameras show nothing. The motion sensors never trigger. But the sound persists, just for a moment, and then it's gone. Diane Cresswell retired in early 2024. Before she left, she told Carver something she'd never mentioned before. She said that on the morning Margaret disappeared, she'd noticed something odd. The air in the archive had smelled like smoke. Not fresh smoke, but old smoke. The kind that lingers in fabric and wood, long after a fire has gone out. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, knowing what had been hidden in the walls, she wondered if the smell had been a warning. Carver asked if she'd ever felt unsafe in the archive. Diane shook her head. She said it wasn't fear she felt. It was sadness. She said the room felt like a place where someone was waiting. Not haunting, just waiting. Paul Holloway passed away in his sleep in March 2024. He was 79. His children found a letter in his desk, written to Margaret and never sent. In it, he said he'd forgiven her for leaving, even though he didn't understand why. He said he hoped she'd found what she was looking for, and he said he'd see her again, wherever she was. The manuscript remains in the university vault. Dr. Hayes completed a full analysis, documenting its contents without reading it aloud. His report concluded that Greer's play was a work of obsessive delusion, an attempt to create meaning from madness. Hayes recommended it never be performed, published, or translated. The university agreed. It sits now in a sealed box, cataloged and forgotten. But every so often, a researcher will request access. They'll cite academic interest, historical curiosity. The university always denies the request, and every time, the researcher withdraws their inquiry without argument, as if something in the denial reminds them why they shouldn't have asked. Margaret Holloway's case is still open. Officially, she remains a missing person. But those who know the full story, Carver, Hayes, Diane, and a handful of others, understand that she won't be found. Not in any traditional sense. She walked into a room that shouldn't have existed and read words that shouldn't have been spoken. And somewhere, in a place beyond doors and walls and time, she's still there. The last person to see the book before it was sealed away was Aaron Pruitt, the student who'd checked it out. He said he never finished reading The King in Yellow, the Chambers version, not Greer's manuscript. He said it made him uncomfortable. Not the stories themselves, but the feeling they left behind. Like something was watching him while he read. Like the book wanted him to keep going, to see what came next. He returned it after 2 days. He never went back to that section of the library, and sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the old buildings settle into themselves, People walking past Crescent Hill Library report seeing a light in the archive window, a soft, flickering glow, like candlelight. The library insists there's no one inside. The security system shows no breach, but the light remains, just for a moment, and then it fades. Margaret Holloway loved books. She loved the smell of old paper, the weight of history in her hands. She believed that stories mattered, that they could teach us, change us, connect us to something larger than ourselves. She was right. But she learned too late that some stories don't just connect us. They consume us. And somewhere, in the space between words and silence, Margaret is still reading, still listening, still waiting for someone to hear her warning and turn back before it's too late. Don't go looking for what's been buried, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.